It's October 1216. Inside the stone walls of Newark Castle, the air is thick with smoke, mildew, and the foul stench of disease. In a dim chamber lit by flickering torches, a man groans on a sweat-soaked bed. His body twists in agony, each breath shallow, each sound a cry of misery. This is no nameless peasant. This is the King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou. This is King John. And he is dying. Not on the battlefield, not with a sword in hand, but in filth, ripped apart from within. The cause? Diarrhea. Not a mild sickness, but a violent, unstoppable infection that left him fevered, delirious, and broken. Chroniclers at the time wrote that it seemed as if the king's insides were bursting outward. The most hated king in England's history was ending his life in the most humiliating way possible. For many, it was justice from God. And yet, in one of history's strangest twists, his horrible death would save his kingdom, and the very failures of his reign would plant the seed of liberty that would echo across the world. But to understand how a king's death from diarrhea could change history forever, we need to go back to the beginning. John was cursed from the start. He was the youngest of King Henry II's 4 sons. By the time John was born, all the good inheritances were already taken. His father gave him a cruel nickname, John Lackland, a prince with nothing, and that name would follow him all his life. But John wanted power. He wanted it desperately. While his older brother Richard, the famous Lionheart, went to fight in the Crusades, John stayed in England and schemed. He spread lies that Richard was dead. He tried to crown himself king. When Richard was captured on his way home, John even worked to keep him locked away. Richard eventually returned, furious but forgiving, and John had to crawl back into the shadows. But in 1199, fate finally gave him what he wanted. Richard was killed by a crossbow, and John, the overlooked younger son, became King of England. At last, John had the crown. And almost instantly he proved he was the worst possible man to wear it. John's reign was one failure after another. Unlike Richard, John was no warrior. Soldiers mocked him as John's soft sword. Against Philip II of France, a brilliant king and commander, John lost battle after battle. By 1204, he had lost Normandy and much of the French land that had belonged to his family for generations. This was more than land. Normandy was the birthplace of England's ruling dynasty. To lose it was the greatest humiliation a king could suffer. John had taken his father's vast empire and watched it collapse in just a few years. And to fund his endless, hopeless wars, John turned savagely on his own people. He taxed England to the breaking point. He demanded money from nobles again and again, squeezing them dry. He created new taxes on inheritance, on property, on trade, on anything he could touch. He forced knights to pay scutage, money in place of military service, 11 times in just 17 years, more than his last 3 predecessors combined. But it wasn't only money. John ruled with cruelty. He fined nobles for imaginary crimes. He seized their lands. Worst of all, he took their children as hostages to guarantee obedience. One story horrified even his ruthless contemporaries. A noblewoman named Matilda de Braos accused John of murdering his young nephew Arthur, a rival for the throne who had mysteriously vanished in John's custody. John's revenge was terrible. He threw Matilda and her eldest son into a dungeon with nothing but a little food. 11 days later, both were dead. A chronicler claimed that in her final madness, Matilda gnawed at the cheeks of her dead child. This was the kind of king John was: cruel, paranoid, and feared by all. But John's arrogance didn't stop with his nobles. He even picked a fight with the church. When the Pope appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, John refused to accept him. In retaliation, Pope Innocent III struck back. In 1208, he placed all of England under an interdict. Overnight, the spiritual life of the nation collapsed. Churches were locked. Bells went silent. There were no marriages, no confessions, no Christian burials. For 6 years, the people of England lived cut off from God. And then, in 1209, the Pope went further. He excommunicated John himself. In the eyes of the church, the King of England was doomed. By 1215, John had done the impossible. He had united the entire kingdom against him. Nobles, priests, and common people all despised their king. The barons rose in open rebellion, storming London. John, abandoned and alone, had no choice but to negotiate. On June 15, 1215, in a meadow at Runnymede beside the River Thames, the barons presented John with a charter. It would later be called Magna Carta, the Great Charter. To the barons, it was a list of demands. To history, it was the first step toward liberty. It declared that the king was not above the law, that no free man could be imprisoned without trial by his peers, that taxes required consent. John, furious but cornered, sealed the charter. The barons thought they had won. But John never intended to keep his promise. He wrote to the Pope, begging him to void it. The Pope agreed. Magna Carta, he declared, was null and void of all validity forever. The barons were outraged. Civil war broke out, the First Barons' War. And in desperation, the rebels made a shocking move. They invited Prince Louis of France to take the English crown. Prince Louis invaded and was welcomed as a savior in London. King John had become a fugitive in his own kingdom. John's last year was chaos. Hated by his barons, abandoned by the church and hunted by the French, he fled across the land with what little remained of his power. In October 1216, disaster struck. John's army crossed a dangerous tidal estuary called the Wash. He made it across safely, but his baggage train, loaded with treasure, money, and the crown jewels of England, lagged behind. As the wagons creaked across the mudflats, the tide surged back in. Horses, soldiers, and wagons sank into quicksand and water. In moments, the entire baggage train was swallowed by the sea. John's treasure, his hoarded wealth, his crown itself, all gone forever. To this day, it has never been recovered. It was more than a material loss. It was a perfect symbol of his reign. Everything John had stolen and crushed his people to obtain was stripped away in an instant. Shaken and furious, John rode on to Swineshead Abbey. There, he feasted recklessly, some say on peaches and cider, others on pears and ale. Whatever it was, his weakened body could not handle it. That night, the sickness began. First came the fever, then the cramps, sharp as knives cutting through his gut. Finally, the diarrhea struck, violent, bloody, and unstoppable. This was no mild sickness. It ripped through the body, shredding the intestines and causing violent, unstoppable diarrhea, often mixed with blood. It left its victims burning with fever, weak from dehydration, and slipping into delirium. For King John, it was pure torture. Too weak to ride, his men carried him in a litter as he suffered in filth, leaving a trail of misery across the countryside. Villagers saw their king pass, but they did not cheer or kneel. They watched silently as the once mighty ruler of England lay helpless, shuddering in his own waste. On October 16th, John reached Newark Castle. For 2 days he lingered, groaning in agony, dictating a will that named his 9-year-old son, Henry III, as his heir. He confessed his sins. He begged forgiveness. But as fever consumed him, he was haunted by the faces of those he had wronged, the barons he betrayed, the nephew he may have murdered, the children he had stolen. On the night of October 18th, King John Lackland died. Alone, broken, despised. Chroniclers wrote with grim satisfaction that the tyrant had been destroyed from within. And yet, his death saved the kingdom. With John gone, the rebellion had no purpose. His young son, Henry III, was innocent, untouched by cruelty. The great knight William Marshal took charge, rushed the boy to Gloucester, and crowned him Henry III. Then Marshal did something brilliant. He reissued Magna Carta, stripped of its most radical demands, but keeping its core. Suddenly, the barons had everything they wanted: a pliable child king and the Great Charter, now backed by a legitimate government. Within a year, the French were driven out. The rebellion dissolved. The tyranny of John had ended. And Magna Carta, the document he had tried to destroy, became the foundation of a new era. Magna Carta did not disappear. It was reissued again and again by later kings. Each time, its principles grew stronger. Over time, it came to mean more than barons versus king. It became a symbol that rulers must obey the law. Centuries later, it would inspire revolutions far beyond England. English lawyers in the 1600s used it to fight against kings who tried to rule by force. In the 1700s, American colonists cited it when they declared independence. Thomas Jefferson himself said it inspired the Declaration of Independence. And in the 20th century, its spirit lived on in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The irony is clear. John fought bitterly to keep absolute power, but it was his failures, his cruelty, his humiliating death that gave birth to the idea that no one, not even a king, is above the law. John's reign was a disaster. He lost Normandy. He lost the trust of his nobles. He lost his treasure, his dignity, and finally, his life. He was remembered as a villain, the cowardly tyrant in Robin Hood stories, the king so hated that no English monarch has ever named their son John again. And yet, from his wreckage came something greater. Magna Carta, the principle that power must have limits, that rulers must be bound by law. John, the king who died in filth and shame, gave the world one of its greatest gifts without ever meaning to. He wanted everything. He lost it all. But in losing, he left behind a legacy stronger than any crown or empire. The worst of kings left the best of legacies.